the next one, so final talk of the morning, afternoon, is Chris Mowat. So Chris is a colleague of mine here at Edinburgh, who I've worked with for 5 years, but I think it's safe to say Chris and I have got to know each other very well in the last 4 months. We've basically been two sides of a coin in managing our own school's response to COVID and so on. And Chris is, as he'll mention himself, I'm sure, a senior personal tutor at Edinburgh, so he's a lot of experience in thinking about the ongoing issues associated with student support and now how they translate online. So Chris, I'll ask you to share your screen and take the wheel.
Okay, so I assume you can see me okay, but since I was told I was a little bit quiet because of my Mac use, can I just check that everyone can hear me okay?
We can hear you. It's just a little bit dim, but it's okay for me. And
A little bit dim? Sounds like me.
um, and just to say, your slides, I know there's some experience. Your slides are just a little bit fuzzy, but from experience, I know that they will tune in eventually. But we can definitely see the text and so on, so it's okay.
Right, good. Okay, well, thank you, and thanks to Michael for the invitation to talk today. So I am, as Michael says, the senior personal tutor in chemistry in Edinburgh. I've been doing that job for 5 years now. And that essentially means that I've got sort of overall responsibility for the student support activities that we do within the school. So I want to tell you about a few things today. I do feel a little bit like a fish out of water because this sort of format and all of you people with lots of experience in education research and that sort of background is not something I really have, but I'm learning very quickly. Um, so what I want to talk about first of all is the idea of belonging and community and some of the assumptions that we might be tempted to make about our students. What I'll then go on and talk about is the specific context that we have in Edinburgh, because I think in terms of developing and building student communities, the actual context of the working environment is hugely important. And I will touch on that because I think it gives an indication as to why we maybe find it a little bit easier than some people, and certainly in our institution, find it. I'll then move on and talk a little bit about how the way that we work or the way that we need to work is all about partnership with the students and crucially getting them involved in terms of peer schemes and peer support networks. Moving on from that, in the current situation, I think in terms of how we address community building next academic year, what we really need to recognise is what we've lost through all of this disruption, and really give some thought as to how we might replace that in some form. Ultimately, though, a lot of what we've been doing over the past few months has been necessarily a little bit piecemeal and ad hoc, but I think we've learned an awful lot from that, and things that we might want to adopt on an ongoing basis. And then finally, I just want to give a little bit of thought about how we adapt to a situation which is really changing quite quickly. And it's difficult to make plans for the next 12 months when we don't really know what the situation is going to be like in 3 or 6. So there was a bit of work that was done in Edinburgh by the university's Sense of Belonging Task Group. So that was led by Ellery Connick, the project officer. And they published that just last month. And I noticed that Matthew Hale actually posted a link to that way earlier on in the chat. What I saw in that immediately was this quote, which says that it's just not enough to expect that students will feel that they belong simply because they've been granted a place to study here. And I presume that that would apply to any university. So thinking about that, what I wanted to think about is what belonging is. So belonging really is that initial feeling of value, that feeling of respect that a student receives. And it's really once a student feels that they belong to a school or to an educational institution, that they can then start to develop that sense of community, which is all about shared knowledge and shared experience. And what's clear about that is that it's not enough just to make sure that we don't prevent students feeling alienated or excluded from what's going on in the school. But we actually have to engage in some real thought about this and actively include all groups of students from wherever they may come from, whatever background they come from, and have dialogue with them around what we can expect from each other. One thing that we notice, or I notice particularly in Edinburgh, is that sometimes the students who you might expect to settle in and form or become part of that community very straightforwardly and very easily are actually the ones who are maybe least comfortable. So particularly in Edinburgh, there are often Scottish students who you might expect would feel well at home, but in actual fact they feel a little bit unprepared, they feel low in confidence in some cases, and largely that can be down to perceived issues of class, for example. So now especially, I think what we need to do is be careful about how we engage our students and not make the assumption that they're all raring to go, that they're really excited about going to university. As has been mentioned earlier on this morning, people have had disrupted ends to their secondary education. They may have had, be enduring a fairly uncomfortable summer, and they may be entering university with a sense of trepidation and not really knowing what to expect. So just to put the Edinburgh chemistry context out there, we are a relatively small school, so we have only around about 650 taught students over our 5 undergraduate years, with a fairly small postgrad taught cohort. Of our undergraduate students, there are only 6 degree streams, 3 MChem and 3 BSc streams. And in terms of the staff that each student will encounter during their time with us, that again is a relatively small number. So we have around about 50 academic teaching staff and technical staff, teaching office staff, numbering around about 10 that students will encounter during their time with us. And the other thing that I think works in our favour is the fact that our estate is fairly straightforward. We have a single building, everything is located within that building. We have our own lecture theatres, we have our own teaching labs under the same roof. And crucially, something that has been incredibly important in helping our sense of community over the past couple of years is this fantastic social space that you can see in that photo. So this is a space that is widely used by everyone, from first year undergrad students sitting having coffee right the way through to the head of school and a bunch of us staff all sitting having coffee. So there's no real barrier there between the youngest undergrad student and the most senior people in the school, which I think again is good at encouraging that kind of informal interaction that is important for community building. The student support is primarily delivered by a small group of personal tutors, essentially hand-picked with support from the teaching office staff. That works really well for us because personal tutors are completely invested. They have relatively high numbers of tutees to look after, and therefore they recognise this as being a really important part of their job. We do aim to have students retain the same personal tutor throughout their degree, so they get the opportunity to build really meaningful relationships right from the very start. And that is facilitated by the fact that our first year chemistry tutorials are taken by the student's personal tutor. So that enables us to see exactly how students are settling in, how they're coping with the material in those crucial first few months. The other thing that I think really helps our sense of community is that we do have quite a number of social events scattered throughout the academic year, starting with a welcome barbecue for our incoming first years and postgrad taught students. But there are other things that carry on just as part of the normal sort of academic calendar. We have a careers evening with alumni coming in. We also have regular international evenings where we'll focus on a particular country and have a student from that country tell us about it and make some food. We give them money so that they can prepare food for everyone. And all of this is done in an atmosphere where the students and the staff undergrad and postgrad students as well are mingling together within that nice social space. It's all very relaxed and informal. And I think these things are incredibly valuable, and certainly my experiences of them is that they encourage students to come along to talk to people that they don't necessarily know, and staff are very good at doing the rounds and getting people talking. The key thing, I think, for us is that we have to begin fostering that sense of community before the students even arrive with us. So that really relies on the way that we communicate with our students once we know that they're coming with us. So it's all about the tone of that communication. It has to come from the right person in order to give that sort of consistent welcome. And we'd like to keep that going and continuing right after until after graduation. So, we're able to build good relationships with our students so that when they leave, we can then call on them for favours. So for the last few years, I've been using connections from students that have passed through the school to mentor our undergraduate students, and that is quite successful. But the whole thing really hinges on partnership between us as staff overseeing all of this and with the students themselves. So in that respect, in Edinburgh, we've got 3 different societies or groups, I suppose, that are involved in supporting each other. So we have our chemistry society, that is a whole school society, so undergrads, postgrads, staff are all involved in that. There are social events as part of that. They bring in guest lecturers and so on. In terms of peer support schemes, we did have a peer learning scheme a few years ago, but it didn't really seem to work. And I think I may be kidding myself, but I like to think that was because the staff did such a good job of assisting their learning. But a few years ago, it must be about 5 years ago now, one of our undergrad students came to me with the idea of setting up an academic families scheme. The model there is that our third, fourth, and perhaps fifth year students would be academic parents and grandparents, and we would then have our first and second year students as the academic children. Family size was round about 10, and what that enabled was this vertical integration of cohorts. So rather than being stuck in year group silos, we had first years socialising with later year undergraduate students. So that would typically involve dinners being hosted at parents' and grandparents' flats and so on, and then the families would all meet up later on for social events. Then I think something which has actually turned out to be very fortuitous was a couple of years ago, the university and the Students' Association signed this student partnership agreement. What they agreed to do there was to fund any sort of staff-student collaborative ideas with the aim of addressing 3 different themes. So one of them was to enhance the student voice, which I think we'd all agree is very important. The second one was in terms of providing academic support. Now, that might seem straightforward, but it's something that certainly in the senior tutor network in Edinburgh we've wrestled with. We didn't really understand what academic support was. It seems to lie somewhere on a spectrum which at one end includes delivering teaching, and at the other end is all about delivering pastoral and well-being support. So essentially my idea was to try and get students to define exactly what they wanted in terms of academic support. And then the third aim was simply promoting good mental well-being. So we actually addressed this from all 3 of those topics. So just to tell you a little bit more about community, so the aim here was really to, in terms of the way we approached it, it was twofold. One was to encourage socialising, but to provide inclusive events. So where ChemSoc events would typically end up in a vodka bar somewhere, we were very cognizant of the fact that we do have a very diverse community and that that's not appropriate for everyone. So the kind of things that we've hosted in the past couple of years have been baking competitions. We had our own bake-off. We had dumpling folding. We had a talent show, and that picture there on the right is myself and my colleague Carol Morrison attempting to perform the periodic table song during last year's International Year of the Periodic Table. It took us a long time to get through it. We've had poetry events, we've had guest organisations coming in to talk to students, mental health charities, for example. And what we've allowed students to do there is really assume ownership of their own resources. So they went at the start of the last academic year and created their own How to Uni videos. So you can see a screenshot from the website there, which shows the 5 different videos that they had uploaded back in, I think, November last year. And as part of that, we essentially created a website for them and gave them the ability to curate it. So what they did was they identified what resources they wanted, and they've mounted those resources. Some of them are academic, some are to do with well-being, and so on. So all of this seems to have had the effect of really bolstering the sense of academic community within the school. And I don't think I'm going too far in saying that sense of community is something that is not felt within some of the other schools in our university. Partly due to some of the contextual issues that I talked about earlier. But that idea that students feel part of the community came through quite strongly as part of our internal periodic review that happened in March. The whole thing is made easier because staff buy into this. They're keen to communicate and to socialise and talk to our students. Having this space that is used by everyone has completely normalised this informal interaction between staff and students. And it's the simple things like learning students' names that help make them feel part of our community. I think we are lucky. I've been kicking around Edinburgh since 1992 when I went through the door as a first-year undergraduate. And the culture of community within the school is something that has persisted throughout that time. And there are lots of old heads, and I would include myself among them, that are still around to keep this going. But again, it's not going to be as easy for other people because we are put at an advantage, I think, by the size and shape of the school itself and the estate, the building that we're working in. Finally, in terms of peer involvement and partnership, I think one of the things which does help, I mean, students, apart from providing food, which is the #1 route to getting students involved, we can give them what's known as the Edinburgh Award for their involvement in this type of activity. So if they're involved in community or in the academic families schemes, then they can be recognised formally by the university with something that they can put on their transcripts. So moving forward, as I try and plan for keeping this community going over the next academic year, I think what we really need to consider is what we've lost. So if you look at these 2 photos, that is our fantastic social space looking pretty antisocial at the moment, set up with physically distanced chairs and tables. We recognise that we'll not be able to have any in-person social events in that space in semester 1. We'll also lose the informality of it, that we know chats over coffee. So the question there is, how do we go about replacing that? And one of the things that we did not a few weeks ago actually was have a forum with our, at that time, just at the end of 3rd year students, to talk to them about a number of different things in terms of what they wanted from their learning experience next year, but also what they wanted from the social program that would normally be a big part of their experience with us. Now, as part of that, I've managed to gather together a group of new 4th year students who are now working on ideas. So they came to me and emailed me almost straight away after the forum that we had, saying that they were glad that we recognised that the socialising, the things that they're going to lose, need to be replaced in order to make them feel part of the school. So I've got nothing to report from that at the moment because I've sent them away to think about it, but this is something we'll be working on over the next month or so. The one thing that really I have to bear in mind is, essentially these two memes. It is really no good for me as a middle-aged man to try and define myself what is going to be valued as community building events and resources by our students. So to my mind, it makes my job a lot easier where we have already got this nice sense of community where students are happy to engage and collaborate with us. I see my job, or our job as the staff, as seeking out those ideas and trying to support them wherever possible. So as part of that, we can learn an awful lot from what we've experienced since everything urgently went online back in March. So one of the things that we found has really worked very well for us in terms of actually maintaining and I think bolstering the sense of community within the school were these twice weekly web chats that Michael and myself and another colleague of ours, Nana Lilienkamp, hosted essentially twice weekly from round about the 25th of March right the way through to the end of the exam diet at the end of May. These were initially a way of trying to just keep engaged with students who were now geographically disparate. Our aim was essentially to keep students informed in an almost real-time basis about what was happening with their arrangements for teaching and their arrangements for assessment. But it evolved into something which was a lot more informal and fun. So we had a sort of business section of these web chats. Then we would move into more informal chat. There was lots going on in the chat thread. Got to the stage where we were able to develop and host quizzes on there as well. And it was quite moving at times, I think. We had significant numbers of students in there sharing their experiences of lockdown, sharing their issues with motivation, their problems with feeling isolated and so on. And those were emotions that we shared. And you can see at the bottom there, that's a still from the recording of one of those chats. We would do the chat, but at the same time have something for the students to doodle on or colour in the background, and it was really quite a nice experience. So, having heard that those were successful, we would get emails saying, "Oh, these were the highlight of the week." The aim, really, as a sort of way of continuing that engagement, is to continue these from August and use them as a reinduction for continuing students. Now that we know, or we have plans forming for how we're going to teach next year, this is going to be a really useful way for us to engage with students and explain that, to encourage discussion between them, and just to get them back into the headspace of studying, even in this different circumstance. I think they'll also be very useful as part of the induction process for our new students. It'll familiarise them with our culture, how we like to do things, the informality of things. They'll get to know key staff, they'll get to know me, we'll get personal tutors involved and so on. And we can get ideas. It's a really good way of having a conversation with our students. And then finally, the online resource that the community team have prepared is already in place. So it's very easy to adapt that and introduce new material which is more appropriate for this hybrid teaching model that we're going to be adopting. And just my final thought is that in the past few weeks, things have been moving quite quickly. Initial thoughts that nothing would be face-to-face next semester have really kind of faded away. And we have to look for an opportunity to get students in the building. We have to look for possibilities of hosting in-person events as soon as that is practical. One of the things that we want to do is to have face-to-face meetings with personal tutors in that first week of the new semester. That's a good way of introducing new students to the building, making them feel like it's worthwhile actually being on campus rather than studying online. And we have to ensure that whatever we provide in terms of trying to boost that community recognises diversity and includes everyone. And there is a role for us really in working with the students to provide guidance to student leaders and kind of head them in the right direction. Other things we can do, we've got an ongoing project involving the entire school community, which is called Chemistry, Sound and Vision 2020. This was meant to be something which would happen in person, but it's a project where we're looking to create music and visual arts that represent the science that we do. And that's something that's led by our colleague Colin Campbell. Now, it's lucky that collaborating on music and art is something which is quite easy to do online, and again, it's a good way of keeping people engaged. So that's something that we'll be looking to do. And I think from all of this, once we get back to a sense of more normality in terms of people being around the building, what we need to do is retain the things that worked. If web chats work, despite the fact that everyone is able to be in the building, then why not keep doing them? And essentially, that is really all I had to say, except to thank Michael. As he said before, we have been working extremely closely over the past 4 months, and it's been an absolute pleasure. I've learned an awful lot. But none of this would be possible without the help in terms of supporting students from the personal tutors in the school and the teaching office staff, who are excellent. And in general, the academic staff in chemistry, who are so keen and happy to socialise and engage with our students. And of course, the main thanks, and I really, really mean it, is our students. They have made my job over the past few months an absolute joy at the times when it wasn't hell. And that's really all I have to say just now, so thanks for listening.
That's great, Chris. Thank you. Sorry, I'm just multitasking. I just finally found the link way back when from Stephanie Cunningham-Ryan's colour-in sheets, so I've just pasted to Google Drive there. So Stephanie's happy for those to be reused as people want. We're close to time, but there was a couple of questions in the chat associated with the thorny issue of groups, assigning groups, and so on. So I think there were 2 dimensions to that. You mentioned something about how you assign tutorial groups, and then I think there were just some general thoughts about maybe in the new world what we think about in terms of groups. I mean, is it intellectual considerations or what? I mean, what kind of things do you think about when you're thinking about group formation?
Well, it's difficult. They're not necessarily hand-picked tutorial groups. So I'm looking there at the question from Cosma. Is that what we were talking about? So it wasn't so much hand-picked tutorial groups. It's more the fact that what we wanted to do was to have more regular interaction between the personal tutor and the students. So this was all about easing that transition, making sure that students became familiar with their personal tutors. My son was a student at Edinburgh in a different school, and he probably met his personal tutor once or twice, and that didn't enable any kind of relationship to be built. So all we're doing there is making sure that the personal tutors are having that regular contact with their students, and that is something that I will assign each personal tutor a number of first-year students, and those first-year students will be in the tutorial groups that are hosted by that tutor. In terms of, I'm just trying to scroll down through chat there. Yeah, I mean, in terms of groups, I'm not seeing anything.
So I suppose there's a default in chemistry, generally perhaps not in our own particular system, where groups emerge from groups they're in labs. So if you're in lab group, you're in our Tuesday morning lab group, but then the tutorial groups you're in tend to, and so suddenly now in this new world, we actually have to think about, well, if we don't have those initial constraints, what do we do about groups? I mean, I think we can go around the houses about groups, but I suppose it's just thinking about. sorry. Yeah.
I think what we need to consider here is it will be difficult to know what we're dealing with until we get to September and find out who's actually present. I get the impression that most students will show up. There were some really good ideas that came out of the forum with the third year students where they had the idea that tutorial groups could be formed on the basis of who people live with, which is a good way of preserving a bubble. You know, if we're doing this sort of test, trace and isolate idea, that if everyone is working in groups with people that they live with, then there's no need for physical distancing and so on. Quite how that is going to work, I will leave to the Director of Teaching to work out.
That is not going to work.
I noticed Dean's comment there about surnames beginning with the same letter. That again, that, you know, that's something we did think about in the past. If you go by alphabetical surnames, then the one thing we noticed is that we ended up with an awful lot of, say, Chinese students in the same group because there was a preponderance of names beginning with Z or W or whatever, and that didn't lead to good, diverse groups. So I think that's something that we've given some thought to and need to continue to do.
Yeah, I mean, there's the old joke in chemistry that if you're married to a chemist, you tend to be, and you're a chemist, you tend to have similar letters in your start of your surname. Yeah. All right, Chris, we'll have to call it time there. But thank you very much for sharing your insight. I think I got a little bit emotional when I saw the social space so empty like that. So I think this issue of how we translate all the great things that you're doing in online is interesting. But I do think it comes back to the repeated message we're hearing this morning about trying to have some presence in an online situation. So I will just sort of finish by trying to share my screen, and it's kind of a bit of a mess. Let me just hide everything here. And if I share screen 2, so hopefully you should just see the program. It's just really to say thank you very much to all of our speakers this morning and the breakout session leaders. Really appreciate your time in preparing the presentations and in really thinking about some of the issues you're figuring out. I think one of the strong messages I've got through in the chat is, and through Twitter, is an appreciation of the honesty as well, in terms of you know, things aren't actually fully there yet, and I think it was Catherine's talk initially who mentioned just a sense of, well, actually just being honest with students about that, and I think that's certainly a useful tactic. Thank you to everybody for engaging in the chat. What I will do is I will send around an email next week with any wrap-up. So I've got some information back from presenters about things that emerged in Mentimeter and so on. We have the slide links and some useful chat links. So I'll try and compile as much as I can over the next few days and send a wrap-up email to everybody next week with the summary of all the meetings. So we'll continue going informally for the next 10 minutes, but just to say thank you everybody for attending. I hope it was useful. I've certainly learned a lot and have a lot to go away and think about, or tell Chris to think about, and we will see how we get on in September. So all the best everybody and good luck with your planning. I'll stop recording.